The question was simple enough to fit inside a single sentence. But no one in that room could answer it without knowing that whatever they said might shape the monarchy for years. Was this still a family matter, or had it crossed into something the crown itself could no longer afford to treat as private? The distinction mattered more than anyone outside palace walls could possibly understand, because families could bend, families could absorb pain, endure distance, and even survive betrayal. Institutions were different. Institutions survived only when the lines around them remained visible. That afternoon, the senior meeting inside Buckingham Palace began without ceremony. No introductions, no unnecessary pleasantries. The king's private secretary arranged the papers in careful order while advisors took their seats with the kind of composure that often hides the greatest unease. Charles remained standing for a moment longer than expected, one hand resting against the back of his chair, as though he were measuring not the room, but the weight of what would soon be said inside it. When he finally sat, he gave a single instruction: speak plainly. No one misunderstood what that meant. The first advisor addressed the issue from the perspective of public sentiment. If Diana's name had indeed been drawn into the conversation surrounding a possible return to royal life, then public reaction would not remain rational for long. It would become emotional. Once that happened, every decision the palace made would be judged not by protocol, precedent, or constitutional sense, but by the far more volatile standards of grief, memory, and moral symbolism. The second advisor spoke in colder terms. If the institution appears to respond to emotional leverage, he said carefully, then it establishes a precedent that private sentiment can alter public structure. Charles did not interrupt, but the sentence landed heavily, because it was not really about one present dispute. It was about every future challenge that might one day follow it. A monarchy built over centuries could not function if its rules shifted each time the past was invoked with enough force. And yet, no one in that room was blind to the cruelty of reducing Diana to a matter of institutional procedure. That was the trap. To speak of her only emotionally risked destabilizing the crown. To speak of her only structurally risked sounding inhuman. Charles understood both dangers better than anyone. For years, he had lived inside the shadow of that contradiction. To the public, Diana remained luminous, unfinished, emotionally eternal. To the family, she remained something more complicated and more painful. Not just beloved, but unresolved. One of the legal advisors then raised a matter that made the room still quieter than before. If suggestions of a reconciliation campaign tied to Diana's legacy continued to gather momentum, the palace might face pressure not merely to respond, but to define, in unmistakable terms, who could represent the working monarchy and on what basis. That would mean clarifying boundaries many had preferred to leave tactfully unspoken. In other words, silence itself was becoming a risk. Charles folded his hands together and stared down at the polished table. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then the king asked the question that had been waiting underneath everything else. And if we say nothing? The answer came almost immediately. Then others will speak for us, Your Majesty. That was the real danger. Not noise, but narrative. Because once a story took hold in the public imagination, facts often arrived too late to matter. Across Windsor, William was confronting the same reality from a different angle. By early evening, he had received a fuller internal briefing, one that laid out not only the rumored messaging, but the possible interpretations it might encourage. Catherine read several pages in silence before setting them aside. She did not offer instant conclusions. She knew William well enough to recognize that what unsettled him most was not the political dimension. It was the personal trespass of it. There are some names the world feels entitled to use because they have become larger than private life. But for those left behind, the name remains a door. Open it carelessly, and everything returns. William stood near the window, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders unmoving. After a long silence, he said something so quietly that it almost sounded as if he had meant to keep it to himself. They never understand the difference between remembering her and using her. Catherine looked at him, but did not rush to answer, because the sentence did not need correction, only witness. The evening light faded slowly across the grounds. Somewhere in the distance, ordinary routines continued. Staff crossed corridors. Security details rotated. Cars moved through gates with practiced discretion. The machinery of royal life remained intact. But within the family itself, old fault lines were beginning to glow again beneath the surface. Later that night, father and son spoke by secure line. No aides listened in. No notes were taken. There are conversations within monarchy that belong to history. And there are others that belong only to blood. William did not begin with anger. That would have been easier. Instead, he began with clarity. If this is allowed to become a negotiation through mother's memory, then every future boundary becomes impossible to defend. Charles listened all the way through. When he answered, his voice carried exhaustion more than resistance. I am not defending the tactic. Then what are we defending? William asked. The question lingered, because it cut past administration and reached the center of the dilemma. What exactly was Charles trying to preserve? Peace within the family? Dignity within the crown? A final hope that fracture did not have to become permanence? The king took a breath before speaking again. We are defending the possibility that duty can still exist without turning into cruelty. William closed his eyes for a moment. He understood his father's meaning, but understanding did not erase the problem. The monarchy had already spent years absorbing instability, reinterpretation, and public confusion. Every attempt at soft handling had created new ambiguities. Every ambiguity had produced new speculation, and speculation, once attached to Diana, rarely remained manageable. She cannot be the bridge for every unfinished argument, William said at last. Not now, not after all this time. On the other end of the line, Charles said nothing at first. Then, quietly, I know. Again those same two words, simple, insufficient, and yet heartbreakingly sincere. By the following morning, the palace had moved into a new phase. Draft responses were prepared in several versions. One was measured and neutral, emphasizing continuity of constitutional roles. Another was firmer, drawing a bright distinction between private family relationships and official royal function. A third, never intended for release unless absolutely necessary, addressed the misuse of emotional legacy more directly than anyone truly wanted. It was the harshest version. And because it was the truest, it frightened them most. Communications staff debated phrasing line by line, not because wording was cosmetic, but because language inside a monarchy behaves like architecture. A weak phrase creates space. A strong phrase closes doors. A compassionate phrase invites interpretation. A precise phrase can trigger backlash. Every sentence had consequences. By midday, reports from media monitors suggested that public interest was accelerating. Commentators were no longer discussing reconciliation in abstract terms. They were beginning to frame it as a moral test of the monarchy itself. Could the king reject what some might portray as an appeal connected to Diana without appearing cold? Could he accept it without appearing weak? Could he remain silent without appearing evasive? Each option carried a cost, and Charles knew it. He requested a smaller private consultation. Only 3 people were admitted: his private secretary, a constitutional advisor, and one senior communications official whose role, on days like this, involved translating personal pain into institutional language. The king asked for the room to be cleared between briefings. When the others stepped out for several minutes, he remained alone beside the desk, the folder open once more before him. The papers inside seemed almost absurdly thin for something capable of reopening an entire era of sorrow. He lifted one page, then another. headlines, interpretations, scenarios, all built around a single, dangerous idea that Diana's memory could still compel the monarchy to rearrange itself. It was then, according to this fictional account, that Charles's restraint finally cracked, not into theatrical rage, but into something far more unsettling. He placed the papers down with sudden force. Not enough to cause a scene, enough to end all illusion. When the officials re-entered, they found not an emotional father nor a sentimental son, but a sovereign who had reached the edge of tolerable ambiguity. His expression was composed, his voice was not raised, yet the authority in it altered the room instantly. "No one," Charles said, "returns to public duty by borrowing the dead." No one answered, because no one could. The sentence carried both grief and judgment in equal measure. It was not merely a rejection of a tactic, it was a declaration of principle. In that moment, the room understood that the issue had changed. This was no longer about whether some pathway to improved relations might theoretically exist behind closed doors. Personal civility could remain possible. Family contact, however limited or carefully managed, might still exist in forms invisible to the public. But institutional restoration was something else entirely. To restore official standing under pressure linked to Diana's memory would not look like compassion, it would look like capitulation. And Charles, for all his reputation as a man of reflection, knew the difference. The communications official then asked the most delicate question of the day. If asked directly, "Your Majesty, should the palace deny that any such consideration is underway?" Charles looked toward the window again, this time not as a grieving man lost in memory, but as a monarch choosing where mercy ended and definition began. "Yes," he said. A pause followed. Then he added, "And make it clear that the legacy of the Princess of Wales is not a matter for negotiation." That was it. No grand speech, no dramatic flourish, just a line drawn in the calmest possible voice. Sometimes the most consequential decisions in royal history arrive without spectacle. Only certainty. When word of the palace position began moving discreetly through internal channels, the effect was immediate. Officials who had spent months preparing for blurred outcomes suddenly understood that the center had hardened. Plans for symbolic openings were put aside. Ceremonial questions were answered more decisively. The possibility of a half return, a partial visibility, a carefully stage-managed thaw carrying public implications was no longer being treated as realistic. At Windsor, William received the update shortly before dusk. He read it once, then a second time. Catherine watched his face carefully, searching for signs of relief, or sorrow, or both. At last he handed her the page. "He's decided," William said. There was no triumph in his voice, only the gravity that accompanies painful necessity. Catherine read the key sentence and lowered the document. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because even when a decision is expected, its finality changes the air around it. It makes theory real. It turns possibility into history. Outside, the evening sky over the estate had begun to darken into a color that seemed almost too heavy for summer. Lamps appeared one by one along the paths. The world beyond the gates remained hungry for emotion, ready to turn every palace silence into a theory and every theory into a headline. But inside those private rooms, what lingered was not victory, it was cost. Charles had not protected the monarchy without injury. William had not defended his mother's memory without reopening his own. And the family itself had not moved further from reconciliation without feeling, somewhere beneath all the constitutional language, the old ache of what had already been lost once before. Yet the palace believed the line had to hold. Because if Diana's memory became a key that could unlock official return, then memory itself would never again be safe from strategy. And that, more than any temporary backlash, was what Charles could not permit. Still, As the night deepened over Buckingham Palace, one final uncertainty remained. Because decisions made inside royal walls do not stay there for long. Sooner or later, the public would sense that something decisive had happened behind the silence. And when that realization finally reached the outside world, it would trigger a second wave of consequences. No private secretary, no advisor, and perhaps not even the king himself could fully control. Because the monarchy had now answered the question inside the room. But another question was already rising beyond it. What happens when a royal family chooses stability over sentiment, and the world decides sentiment mattered more?